Hello, everyone. My name is Zoe Boyte-Thomas. And for my policy advocacy project, I focused on Texas Senate Bill number 11, which involves the Texas Education Code and student mental health in Texas. Let's begin. There we go. So an overview of this presentation, we will begin with a policy analysis of the background of SB 11. We'll go into the policy formulation and modification of SB 11 and the Texas Education Code. And we'll then dive into my tactics and actions to implement these changes and end with an evaluation of the tactics and actions thus far. All right, so first let's get into the definition of what the Texas Education Code is, because I'll be referencing that throughout this presentation. Basically, just in simple terms, the Texas Education Code are Texas state laws involving education, just statewide. Just the collection of all different laws that have been passed involving education in Texas. So what is SB 11? SB 11, it's a fairly lengthy bill of amendments to the Texas Education Code. Two parts being pretty much student mental health related amendments and school safety related amendments. So under the student mental health portions of SB 11, this involved the formation of the TCMHCC, which is the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium. And that is basically it's a network that was designed to improve interventions in Texas schools when it comes to student mental health resources and interventions. This led to the creation of things like CPAN, which is the Child Psychiatry Access Network, and T-Chat, which I think is maybe a little bit more familiar to people. That's basically online therapy resources for students within Texas. In addition to that, we had some parts involving staff trainings, especially focusing on trauma-informed care within schools. And then also mental health resource inventory creation, which was basically dictating that the TEA, the Texas Education Administration, would create inventories of resources for mental health needs in schools that involve community resources that are already pre-existing. It just is basically consolidating those resources into an easy to use kind of list per district. On the school safety side of these amendments within SB 11, we have updates to danger response protocols within schools, especially focusing on school shooting protocols and emergency response to those. And then also updating building safety codes to anticipate any events such as that. In this presentation, we're mostly focusing on student mental health under SB 11 in the Texas Education Code, but still school safety was involved in this bill, so that is going to be mentioned. All right, and then, so why was SB 11 passed? Looking at the mental health side of things, there is and has been a student mental health crisis in Texas and nationwide for decades, really. I have my next slide is a infographic kind of breaking down some of the statistics with it. But it can be presumed that this increase in mental health supports is an attempt to mitigate that crisis that is ongoing. On the school safety side of things, again, with school shootings, there's been that increase in the past decade or two of school shootings, notably with around the time that SB 11 was passed. There's the Santa Fe High School shooting in 2018 in Houston. And then this was in 2019 that SB 11 was passed. So it can be presumed that that kind of correlated with some of those parts that were involving the physical safety of students. Here's that infographic. I'll try to move myself a little bit. So yes, so I'll just briefly read over this. But basically 1 in 5 children ages 0 to 11 experience a mental disorder in a given year. I believe this is not national averages, but still applying to Texas as well. Of those children, 10% have impairment in daily functioning at home due to these mental health problems. 70% in the juvenile justice system suffer from mental disorders, and 27% of youth experiencing these disorders experience them so severe that it affects their ability to function severely. And then 50% of all mental illnesses begin at age 14. But yes, very much so a nationwide epidemic, really, of mental health problems in children that states are kind of scrambling to address. Whenever we are looking at the effectiveness of SB 11, so this bill was passed in 2019, right before the COVID pandemic, which is something to note when it comes to the implementation of new services. Some of those were delayed due to this, the unexpectedness of COVID-19. But under the TCMHC, these telehealth services that I mentioned, CPAN and TChat, were created and implemented, and they have began kind of rolling out these services to school districts across Texas, largely focusing on these online resources. And in addition to that, there's been that collaboration between it uses a lot of different universities, like psychiatry departments, to collaborate on effectiveness of interventions and just research overall when it comes to student mental health. And then the Texas School Mental Health Resource Database was established in 2022 by the TEA, by the Texas Education Administration or agency. And this is notably a pretty swift response from the TEA and school districts to start this database, where it just makes it easier to connect these students to their resources. So what it set out to do has began being implemented in statewide like districts. All right. Whenever it comes to modifying SB 11 in the Texas Education Code, there are some notable issues that SB 11 does not address when it comes to mental health in schools and for students. One of the most obvious to me was the need for in-person mental health supports for students. Again, TCMHCC established these online resources, but that still leaves us with that lack of many in-person mental health resources for students, which are really very crucial whenever it comes to identifying which students are in need of resources, whether it be online or in person. Just because having somebody really in the community of the school and surrounding community area can just really benefit when it comes to that identification aspect, and also just the implementation of services. So that's still definitely some aspect that is lacking in Texas schools still under the Texas Education Code. And then what the positions that are open, that are in person, are largely understaffed in schools. And that could be due to a plethora of reasons, from lack of funding to some aspects I'll be touching in the next slide. But connecting to that, there's no universal mental health professional guidelines statewide, meaning that when it comes to the distinct professionals that provide mental health services, from school counselors, school social workers, and licensed school psychologists, there are no currently, under the Texas Education Code, there's no specific guidelines that require a certain number statewide or certain titles statewide, at least when it comes to counselors and school social workers. They can be kind of lumped together into, for example, Austin ISD has licensed mental health professionals, which can include social workers or counselors, therapists, that kind of thing, just all sorts of different titles under that, while they really are meant to provide specific services under each of those titles. So that lack of guidelines can contribute to that understaffing and kind of not confusion, but chaotic nature to mental health professionals within schools. And so with that said, some improvements to SB 11 that I identified would be firstly connecting to the funding of mental health professionals in schools. That again could be contributing to that understaffing of mental health professionals. Also, it's currently linked between school mental health professionals and then school safety funds. Like those two are linked together when it comes to funding, which can take away from that mental health funding for schools, since that has to be allocated between those two different areas within school districts. And in addition to that, a lot of districts have been relying on COVID-19 relief funds to fund mental health resources. That's all coming to an end largely within the state, which again leads to needing an increase in school mental health funding in order to continue these roles that have been established or to create new roles. And then school mental health professionals, district and statewide, there's a few different ways that could be improved. Again, when it comes to largely focusing on understaffing of these roles, creating some statewide guidelines to have distinct roles be available to professionals to apply to and then obtain these roles. So having a certain amount of counselors and a certain amount of school social workers be listed and posted to district websites, hired to fill these different and distinct roles could definitely be helpful when it comes to attracting different professionals that can provide different services. And in addition to that, having specific job requirements under each of these roles that are universalized could be useful when it comes to really utilizing what each of these roles are able to fulfill within a school district. And then lastly, ratios of school mental health professionals is definitely an area of improvement. Right now, there is a national recommended one counselor and one school social worker per 250 students, just as a national, like a recommendation nationwide. Texas currently has double that amount for school counselors, meaning there's one counselor per 400 or so students. And then much worse is there's currently one school social worker per 13,000 students in Texas, which is just obviously a very high ratio for any real mental health services to be performed by those school social workers. And with that said, when it comes to that ratio of school social workers, another idea for helping fill those roles and creating new roles could be expanding acceptable qualifications under the school social worker title, meaning that right now it's a requirement, I believe statewide, for school social workers to be a licensed, at the very least LMSW, a licensed master of social work, social worker. And one way that we might be able to expand that would be letting people substitute experience, like a certain number of years experience with a bachelor's in social work in a therapeutic setting, to let that substitute a license or even moreover, expanding the accessibility of licensures and of master degrees as a whole when we look at a big picture. Yeah, so those are some of my recommendations. It spans obviously a couple different areas when it comes to policy change, but those are some ideas when it comes to that recruitment aspect and fulfilling of multiple positions that could lead to those in-person supports for students. And then when it comes to the impact of any of these new policies, Of course, again, this would be increasing those mental health resources in schools, focusing on that in-person need for supports. And then with that said, there would also be that more efficient identification of students who need these resources and then an adequate response to these needs. Additionally, there would be hopefully that improvement of student mental health as additional in-person supports are created, more positions are filled with these improvements, and then hopefully a decrease in student mental illness and suicide statewide. Now, the feasibility of these policy changes, I'd like to refer back to what we discussed with the TEA and how they were able to create that database at the as responding to SB 11. With that in mind, I believe that TEA would be able to make these changes when it comes to rolling out like new statewide requirements for like how different positions are listed, and the different requirements under the positions of like the roles and responsibilities, and then if they were expanding qualifications, that kind of thing, when it comes to just the logistics, because largely the suggestions are just like logistical and just making it more accessible for professionals to find and then fill these roles. But with their rapid response to SB 11, at the TEA level, it seems feasible for them to be able to implement these new roles or new rules and responsibilities. Now, when it comes to potential pushback, that I would expect more at a district-wide level when it comes to funding. In this presentation, we aren't focusing fully on funding. We're mostly looking at that recruitment aspect. But when it comes to if like a district, because right now there's not a whole lot of rules of like how many roles are needed, that kind of thing. So if a district suddenly needs a certain number of social workers in their school, then the question is, how would they be funding that? And would that take away from other aspects of the district that they are currently funding? So definitely some potential pushback on that, depending on those more local level changes that would be happening. And that's just something to keep in mind of a potential issue later down the line. All right, when it comes to strategy of implementing these policy changes, I looked at this from both a local level, a state level, and an online level of approach. So tactic number one that I used was to begin having conversations of student mental health within my community, my local community. I'm a teaching assistant in a school that works with students with disabilities. So that really involved me, I say educating, but really just having conversations with the teachers that I work with and a few parents just on what they notice about student mental health needs. My teacher, for example, she's from another state. So talking about what did it look like in her state, just kind of bouncing around different ideas on student mental health, and while also spreading that information of like, there's definitely room for improvement. This is, some ways that I could see that happening. Like, what do you think? Just starting those discussions, while also doing number two of listening to their concerns as well, and just learning from each other, really, just to begin that conversation. Tactic number two, still at the local level. Again, I'm a teaching assistant. I'm in Austin ISD. So another tactic could be attending board meetings in Austin ISD, where different district-wide rules are passed and also discussed at that local level. So that began with researching AISD board meetings, when they're held, how they function, like when different voting happens on what and when things are discussed, that kind of thing. Second, it would be observing board meetings for a few months and their monthly meetings. So observing how they go, how things are decided, that kind of thing. And then number three would be advocating in board meetings in the future. So not holding testimony, but voting on different things while also speaking up for student mental health in my local district. Tactic number 3, voting. That was for me probably one of the easiest tactics to do. This began with me researching candidates in the November 2024 election, both at local, state, and nationwide level. Second was locating where my polling locations were around me, and then determining what day worked for me to vote. Lastly, I went and voted, early voted on those who I thought would align with these goals of student mental health improvement, that kind of thing. My 4th tactic at the statewide level was emailing legislators about student mental health. So this began with me determining local, state officials' contact information. And I then drafted emails to 3 different state officials, being the Texas state senators, and then one of the House of Representatives that were involved in the education committees. So I drafted those emails, and then I sent out those emails to their respective contact informations. And then lastly, it will involve me following up in the future, beginning this month, as I still haven't heard any emails back yet in response to this. It was largely informative. I have my email in a few slides from now, but also like a call to action. So yeah, so following up with them, possibly with phone calls as well. Tactic number 5, still at the state level, is joining the Texas School Social Work Network, TSSWN. This network is basically school social workers in Texas joining together to collaborate on a lot of what I was talking about, of just what the roles need to look like at a state level or statewide, like expanse, like universalizing the role of a school social worker in Texas, and also just passing ideas back and forth on school social work related things at a state level. So this is a more long-term goal of mine, or tactic, starting with graduating from my master's program at Texas State, and then earning licensure to then practice as a school social worker, which leads to number 2, which is applying, interviewing, and being picked, hopefully, for a school social work position in Texas. Ending with me then applying to join TSSWN, hopefully being accepted, and then beginning to collaborate with TSSWN on these goals of mine and theirs. Tactic number 6, this is taking us to the online portion of my tactics. This is creating a social media post with a survey and petition. So this I chose to do on Reddit, because that doesn't require like a certain amount of following for you to have a post that could gain popularity or like spread pretty far. You just post them to different communities within Reddit. So for me, that would be a social work community, school social work community, and so on, related communities. So this involved creating the content, which, like I said, social media post with just information on the issue, but also including a survey of what school social work looks like in Texas. But I think depending on the community, it would also be like nationwide responses. But what their school social work looks like, their experience within school social work, just related questions to kind of universalizing school social workers, and then a petition to pass one to multiple of these changes to the Texas Education Code. So definitely focusing on Texas school social workers. Second would be posting this content once it's created, and then as this hopefully gains traction, compiling data gained from the survey and the petition, and also just the discussion, and then using that hopefully with state legislators to advocate for these changes and show support for them. And then lastly, tactic number 7, still using online resources, is posting an infographic on student mental health. With this approach, I was thinking of using like Instagram, Facebook, that sort of community. And with that being said, I don't personally have a very large following on social media. So that involved me, after creating this content, uh, identifying mental health groups on social media that hopefully have larger followings than I, and then reaching out to these groups with this infographic, a little bit about my policy changes that I'm advocating for, and hopefully collaborating with them to post this infographic on their pages and reach a larger audience, informing them on just different statistics and then the changes that could improve student mental health in Texas. When it comes to proof of my advocacy, first is my voting. This is a little Google Sheets page that shows my name having voted in the November election. I believe it's also linked at the very end of this presentation. And then also a picture of my I voted sticker, showing that I did in fact vote this year. Lastly, we have an email to Senator Sarah Eckhart that I sent to her. Feel free to pause if you want to read my email. But just informing her of student mental health resources in Texas and how they need to be improved. Okay, lastly, we have my evaluation of this project. So starting with, how did everything go? So when it comes to what part I believe was most effective in this policy advocacy journey, I think that my conversations with my community were most effective and the biggest learning experience for me, as I discussed my thoughts and learned others' thoughts on student mental health at my local level. I think I gained the most from that when it comes to starting conversations and just learning from the experience. When it comes to what worked less well, the emails I've sent out have yet to be responded to. So far emails have not been the most effective for me. But I do plan on doing those follow-up, probably phone calls, just to have more of a direct rapport with either a representative of a legislator or the legislator themselves, to see if we can get a ball rolling on some kind of discussion. Lastly, any different approaches I might have done would be when it comes to TSSWN, the Texas School Social Work Network. I probably could have reached out to them and tried to collaborate without having joined their organization. It didn't necessarily have to be a far-off goal. So I might in the future just reach out and see if we can generate a discussion together in order for it to be a quickly impactful part of the goal. Next part to my evaluation. Has the policy change been fulfilled yet? Not yet. And why is this? Is that this is a complex policy change. This would be something that would have to go through the state legislator, be passed as a bill, introduced as a bill, then passed as a bill, whether it be in the House or the Senate. And that is something that takes some time. This project was really just my attempt to start generating those conversations on student mental health, start spreading information, gain new perspectives on it, that kind of thing. Just really start a ball rolling, but hopefully eventually getting to that point of, okay, we can collaborate with the legislator and get something introduced into the legislature. But it's going to take some time. When it comes to if these policy changes were fulfilled, potential systems that would be involved would be the education system, of course, statewide through Texas. This would be statewide, but then trickle down to a more meso level of like district wide and then locally. And that leads to the potential fallout of if these bills were passed. That probably most concerns the district and local level when it comes to, again, funding. If there is a need for new positions, which my my hope and impression would be that there's currently a lot of unfilled positions for mental health professionals that that could hopefully be reworked into more specific roles, therefore not like taking away funding from anything else by really just reworking those old roles into something new that could be more beneficial. But there is still that potential for a district to not be even hiring any kind of mental health professional, or like a very small amount, and they would need more to equal out a ratio of like 1 to 250. That was mentioned earlier. So that could potentially take away that funding from another area of the school. So that is definitely something to consider when we are looking at the future for recommendations for the future. So that last bullet point would be to continue and to increase advocacy for additional funding for school mental health resources. Again, right now it's a little bit convoluted in that it's linked with overall school safety, I believe at a statewide level. So having a distinct mental health part of funding for each school district would be very advantageous when it comes to creating new roles or just having more funds to really really benefit students when it comes to mental health resources. In addition to that, recommendations would be to continue discussions on student mental health in your local community. If you're a teacher, obviously talking with fellow teachers. If you're not, then whatever your social work role is, collaborating with whoever might be interested in something like this. And even if they're not, just having it out there, and spreading that information both in person and online when it comes to just educating the public on these needs of students and how much improvement there really can be to mental health in schools. And then lastly, the part on continuing research on effective student mental health interventions. I believe that SB 11 really, that was a big part that they succeeded on, in that they created the TCMHCC, which involves a lot of research on effective interventions, but just continuing that and then being sure to focus on that implementation aspect as well as the research. And that brings us to the end of my presentation. So thank you all for listening. Here is my references. Again, you're welcome to pause, or if you can click or copy a link to anything that interests you, go right ahead. But that brings us to my conclusion, and I thank you all for watching.